you scared the life out of me! Bloody hell, I wasn't expecting you so soon. You weren't supposed to see me like this. But seeing as you're here anyway, I may as well tell you what I've been up to. I've taken another dive into the world of Banjo-Kazooie. I used to think there were only 3 games: Banjo-Kazooie, the first, Banjo-Tooie, the second, Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, the third. But apparently there are more, and one of the more is Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Revenge. This game is a Game Boy Advance adaptation of the Bear and Bird, and when I found out it existed, I was very curious about it. The thing about the Banjo-Kazooie series is that it's actually pretty inconsistent. The 3 games that I've played and reviewed all have their similarities, but when you look a bit closer, they're actually quite different. Zooie is a simple collectathon, Tooie is a more complicated and unnecessarily more enormous collectathon, and NAB is not only one of Australia's largest banks, but also a sort of vehicle-based playground with gameplay you wouldn't even think to associate with the Bear and Bird. The games in the series vary quite wildly, so I was curious to see which direction Grunty's Revenge would go in. Obviously it came long before Nuts and Bolts, so there won't be any fun vehicle engineering going on, which is unfortunate, considering how much I adore it. But therefore, it's fair to assume that it'll be sticking within the realm of Zooie and Tooie, and I'm curious to see how it will go. So, if you promise not to scare the loving shit out of me again, we can get stuck in. As I understand it, Grunty's Revenge and its story bridge the gap between Zooie and Tooie. It's not a gap that I thought was in particular need of bridging, but if that's the bridge they want to spend valuable taxpayer money on, who am I to stop them? The game begins in Spiral Mountain, as every Banjo-Kazooie game does. As this is taking place after the events of the first game, but before the events of the second game, Grunty is still stoned. Under a boulder. Her assistant Cunnilingus can't seem to move that boulder, so he comes up with the genius idea of constructing a mechanical body, allowing Grunty's spirit to take control of it and cause chaos once again. Her first evil deed is kidnapping Kazooie. The plan? To, somehow, go back in time to prevent Banjo and Kazooie from ever meeting in order to prevent them from defeating her in the first place. Seems a bit over the top. Most people just pick themselves up and try again, but Grunty's planning on a little bit of historical revisionism. It's at this point that Mumbo Jumbo jumps in and uses his own time travel powers to send Banjo back to that same time so that he can rescue Kazooie and defeat Grunty yet again. Now, as a story premise for a simple GBA game, it's fine enough. But let's just hold on a minute. Since when did Mumbo Jumbo have time powers? I thought all he could do was transformations and also walk around for long drawn out periods of time. Where did this come from? The craziest thing about this is that revelation is not the craziest thing about this. If Mumbo Jumbo can send Banjo back in time, why would he not simply send Banjo back in time to a few minutes earlier so that he can stop Grunty from kidnapping Kazooie before it happens? That would save him all the effort of going on a dangerous adventure through the past. You could just nip it in the bud. By that same logic, if Mumbo Jumbo can send Banjo back in time, why would he not use that power to send Banjo back in time to stop Grunty from kidnapping Tootie and saving everyone the trouble of exploring Grunty's lair in the first game? What's wrong with Mumbo? Why did he not bring up his time powers until now? Does he just like the idea of women being kidnapped, like some sort of accidental pimp unintentionally sending off his prostitutes? Also, he should have used his time travel powers to prevent the events of Banjo-Tooie from ever happening as well. That way, I wouldn't have had to play the fucking thing. I have been told, by many people, many angry people, that Banjo-Tooie is good, but... Nah, you know what? I'm not going to get into it. The point is, Mumbo could have saved Banjo and Kazooie, and by extension me, a lot of time and effort, but he's chosen now and only now to use this time travel power, so we may as well make the most of it. And so we find ourselves in the Spiral Mountain of the past, starting off our adventure to save Kazooie and kick Grunty's shiny metal ass. Now obviously, I've never played this game before. I didn't even know it existed until recently, so I don't know what I'm getting into. But I reckon I can have a pretty good guess at how this is going to go. The Banjo-Kazooie series, as it was at the time of this game's release, was a series of 3D collectathon platformers, where the goal was to explore 3D levels in search of collectibles, often earned by completing platforming challenges, and or various other objectives. Grunty's Revenge I expect to be a more simplistic version of this. I've seen this sort of thing done before, where a successful 3D platformer gets adapted for the GBA, making slight changes to how it all works, but keeping the essence of the originals intact. I've seen Crash Bandicoot do it, I've seen Spyro the Dragon do it, and I'm about to see Banjo-Kazooie do it. Considering the GBA's limitations, I expect Grunty's Revenge to maintain the collectathon formula, but be a lot smaller in scale, a lot simpler in its objectives, and a lot less 3D, because the GBA just can't pull that off. But above all else, I expect it to be, and hope it will be, fun. Because that's what games are for. We don't play games to fuck spiders, do we? After exploring the hub world, Spiral Mountain, and completing the first level, Cliff Farm, to 100% completion, my expectations were pretty bang on. Grunty's Revenge tries to emulate the 3D environments and Banjo's gameplay as best it can. The goal is very much the same, to go around levels collecting notes and jiggies, to learn new moves and access new levels. I would say the first impression was pretty decent. The first level was rather simple, somehow even simpler than Mumbo's Mountain, but it was fun to play through nonetheless. What I was relieved to see was that it, and the game as a whole, took after the first game more than the second. The level was a good size with no enormous empty voids, there were plenty of collectibles scattered about, and it wasn't at all a hassle to collect everything. It was a solid start. But I will admit, while I was expecting it to be simple, this opening level felt a little too simple. It never quite hit me how reliant Banjo is on Kazooie. All of his best moves involve her, including the double jump, the talon trot, the drill move, all kinds of things. Without her, he's not capable of a whole lot. All you have available in this level is a basic attack and a basic jump, and most of the objectives you complete have to be built around that limited moveset. That leads them to being extremely simple. One of the jiggies in Cliff Farm is awarded for literally just killing an enemy with a standard attack. That jiggy felt like a participation trophy. I didn't do anything to earn that. Banjo's separation from Kazooie was starting to worry me. Kazooie being kidnapped is the whole story of this game, so I naturally thought, oh no, the whole game is going to be like this. Banjo will be on his own for the whole thing. And that would be bad, because it would mean that the gameplay wouldn't get any more interesting than this. It would be limited to what Banjo is capable of solo, and it's not much. But luckily my fears were put to rest, because in the second level, Brigo Beach, Kazooie is rescued and permanently reunited with Banjo to become the powerful dynamic duo that I know. From Brigo Beach onwards, it felt like proper Banjo-Kazooie. It didn't all come at once, Bottle's ancestor drip fed me the classic moves I knew, but I was glad to see it all return. And it did feel pretty close to how it was in the main games. Obviously some things had to be left out, because the GBA doesn't have enough buttons to include it all, but what was included felt right. The exploration, the platforming, the collectibles, the objectives, it all felt familiar, which is what you want from a game like this. They somehow even managed to make the levels feel 3D. They're obviously not 3D, but the way they're laid out and the way you traverse them gives off the illusion that they are. It's like how you know that having a bath means you're stewing in your own filth, but you still believe that you're washing yourself anyway. It's that sort of thing. Grunty's Revenge includes the hallmarks of a Banjo-Kazooie game. It involves the exploration, it involves objectives, it involves collectibles, it involves learning new moves, it involves transformations by Mumbo Jumbo, it involves whistling along to earworms because the composers know how to make catchy tunes. Get out of my head! But it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. While I don't think any part of the gameplay is necessarily bad, none of it is remarkably good either. Yes, it managed to replicate Banjo and Kazooie themselves pretty well for a GBA adaptation, but the everything else didn't really translate as well. A lot of the objectives, like I said, are very simple. Not always a bad thing, sometimes you need simpler objectives, especially in the early levels of the game. But pretty much all of the objectives in Grunty's Revenge can be branded as simple. Precious few of them jumped out at me as being particularly fun or interesting. I liked the Sandcastle Jiggy in Spiller's Harbour, that was a cool idea, as was the Candlelighting Jiggy in Bad Magic Bayou. But other than those two, I can't think of any objectives that stood out to me as being unique or remarkable. Even in the end game, they're often very easy and straightforward objectives. Some of them even repeat themselves. You've got multiple variations of this fishing minigame, same goes for this slide minigame, you've got multiple swimming objectives as the squid transformation, you've got multiple tile puzzles with a tank, a few fetch quests that involve picking up enough of a certain item, even the bosses are recycled multiple times each. You fight Mecha Grunty and Cunnilingus more than a couple times. There's just a lot of the same stuff in every level. It's fine the first time, but eventually it ends up getting stale and crusty. I also think the actual level structure is a bit weak as well. They did pull off making these 2D levels feel like 3D levels, but the actual way they're laid out isn't anything special. You can only see the level from the one angle, so the developers have less freedom with how they can design the levels. You can only do what you can see. There are no hidden routes or items behind objects in the environment, there's nothing above or underneath you, it's just what you can see. The platforming you do is very basic, and the levels are quite small, a lot smaller than I expected them to be. When you compare that to the brilliance of the levels in the first game, and I guess Tui if you really want, it makes the levels in this game look pathetic. Because of all this, I found the exploration aspect of the game to be a bit underwhelming. The level design felt less creative, there was less going on, and there was less to admire. Some levels I found outright dull. Spiller's Harbour was one of them, because it's just 3 relatively flat main areas containing smaller areas that are also flat. It's also the only level where they tried to be sneaky and actually hide a secret. I set out to 100% this game, because that's just what you do in collectathons. Spiller's Harbour was a part of that journey, and I was doing well, rounding everything up, until I got to a point where I had everything except for 5 notes. And I shit you not, I lost my mind looking for those 5 notes. I scoured every corner of Spiller's Harbour, going back and forth between every area, looking in every single nook and cranny I could find. I spent well over an hour looking for these 5 missing notes, and I just could not find them. I wanted to give up. I started to think, maybe I should approach this game like jazz. It's not the notes you play, it's the notes you don't play. And I was thinking I should just play jazz instead of this game. But as I was about to quit my 100% journey, I accidentally picked up the bundle of 5 notes that was hidden behind the giant Jinjo statue completely out of sight. How in the fuck was I supposed to know they were there? Why would I ever think to check behind that statue? It was bullshit, it was horseshit, it was dog shit, and it was batshit. And guess what? That's probably the most interesting thing they did with the level design. The levels just don't have that magic that they did in the main games, especially the first game. Now admittedly, this isn't the fault of Grunty's Revenge. Most of this is down to the limitations of the Game Boy Advance. It's only capable of so much, so it's obviously not going to deliver a better experience than the main games, and it's not really fair to compare them. Because it's on the GBA, the levels need to be small and simple. It can't handle anymore. The objectives need to be basic, there's only so much they can pull off on this tiny thing. That's probably why they had you fight Cunnilingus over and over. That's all they could come up with. And also, the game is incredibly short. There are only 6 levels in this game, and that includes the Spiral Mountain hub world. It's over before it really gets going. I don't know if that's solely down to the GBA's limitations, but it likely played a part. There are GBA-related hurdles that this game couldn't clear, so it's obviously unfair to compare this game to its N64 cousins. For what it is, and for what console it's on, Grunty's Revenge did a pretty decent job. Better than most of the Spyro GBA games, that's for sure. But what I find interesting is that the GBA limitations did sort of indirectly fix a lot of the issues I had with Tui. Rather than levels being massive and empty, they were dense and packed with things to do. Rather than everything being a convoluted web of backtracking and slow progress, you could do everything as you went without any hassle. Of the 60 jiggies in the game, I only had to backtrack for 1. And also, I feel like Grunty's Revenge had charm. Not as good as the first game, of course, but it had that same goofy, cheery, whimsical personality that I feel Tui sort of lost. I just find it interesting that the GBA forced the devs to reel it in and not get too carried away with scale. That leads me on to presentation as well. I think the game is very well presented, especially for a GBA game. There was a good variety of environments despite the low number of levels, and while every single one did closely resemble levels from the other games, I feel like they still managed to have their own identities. And like I mentioned earlier, the catchy soundtrack in this game is great. Not as iconic as the other games, but still pretty good. It's enough to get stuck in my head and make me want to slam it into a wall in the hopes that my brain leaks out of it and puts me out of my misery. Bit extreme? The point is, the presentation impressed me. For a GBA adaptation of this series, I think they nailed it. But that all brings me to the question that's been bouncing around in my head like the DVD logo since I started playing this game. And that's, what's the fucking point? That may seem like a pretty sudden and harsh thing to say, but I was genuinely thinking about it the whole time. What is the point of this game? It's not to introduce new gameplay ideas, it just implements watered down versions of gameplay ideas the series has used already. It's not about the story, it takes place between 2 games whose stories pretty comfortably fit together already. This game just adds in a random, inexplicable middle bit. The only thing I can think of is that it's literally just to get the Banjo-Kazooie series on handhelds. And you know what? Fair enough, I can't really argue with that. Besides, what's the point of any game? That's a massive question. But it's not a question that's really occurred to me before until playing this game, so I felt like I had to at least bring it up. At the end of the day, Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Revenge is a decent game. It seems rude to just say that it's mildly enjoyable, but that's truly how I feel about it. It didn't excel in any particular area, but it didn't fail in any particular area either. The gameplay had all of the key features of a Banjo-Kazooie game, the presentation was good, it was enjoyable. But it did have some flaws. It's a very short game with only 6 levels, most of which don't have particularly interesting layouts or objectives. Some objectives are recycled, leading to a lack of variety. It isn't particularly strong in the story department, with a story that raises more questions than it answers. And the 5 notes I couldn't find in Spiller's Harbour can suck my Spiller's Harbour. I would recommend this game, but only to people who are hardcore Banjo-Kazooie fans. It'll be a short and sweet blast of the Baron Bird goodness you love. But for everyone else, it's not really worth it. It doesn't really add anything of value to the franchise, and you won't miss out on anything if you skip this game. So yeah, in short, Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Revenge is alright, but it probably wasn't worth the effort of playing it. Rah! Did I get ya?